Newspaper Society has written to search engine Google asking it to compensate Indian newspapers for using their content and to share details of its ad revenues. Now this after a bill was passed by the Australian Parliament, which has become a code now, which is going to help the providers of news earn some revenue if Google or Facebook use their content. Therefore, on India Revival Mission today, we are going to discuss, should India also ask Google to pay the content creators for using their digital content? That's the big focus on India Revival Mission today. I'm Hina Gambhir, and joining me today on this show is Mr. R. Chandrasekhar, who is Chairman, Centre for the Digital Future and former Secretary, Electronics and IT, Government of India. We have Jayant Mammon Matthew, who is Chairman, Digital Committee, INS, that is Indian Newspaper Society, and Executive Editor, Malayalam Manorama. We also have with us Siddharth Padmanabhan, who is a former Facebook employee and co-founder, blackcoffee.media. Thank you very much, all of you gentlemen, for joining us here on India Revival Mission. First, let me ask Mr. Matthew, since the Indian Newspaper Society has already written to Google, sir, what are your concerns and what is it that you are demanding?
You know, the INS has actually three asks. First, INS has asked Google to pay for content because, you know, it's very essential that credible content is propagated on the digital spectrum, and credible content also costs money. So INS has requested Google that they should start paying for our content which appears on Google. The second ask is we've asked for a larger share of advertising from Google. We've said that we need at least 85% of the advertising which appears on our sites. And the third ask is that it's important that credible news sites come up in the top search rankings as opposed to some obscure site which comes up, and you know that's a main cause for a lot of misinformation and fake news. We believe that it's this credible news which is on Google which actually gives it all the authenticity. And it's also important for a vibrant democracy like India that credible news and information is readily available. So that's INS's ask.
So three big demands are there. Before I go across to Mr. Chandrasekhar, I have one very quick question for you. Your second demand was that you're seeking larger share of advertising. Already, do you get some share of advertising, or you're just seeking a big amount?
Yeah, we get a very small share of advertising.
Okay.
You know, as you know, 80% of advertising in digital goes to the tech platforms.
Okay.
For us as publishers, we get a very small share. We actually don't know the percentage of amount which we get because the whole advertising ecosystem of Google and the tech platforms is extremely opaque, and it's also very complex.
So you're seeking transparency on that aspect as well. Mr. Chandrasekhar, what will you say about these concerns that Mr. Matthew has raised, and also how Australia has now come out with a bill which has become a code in which, Google and Facebook will have to pay to the content creators, to news publishers specifically?
Yeah, I think this issue has to be looked at two different levels. One is, if you look at it at a very generic level, not with regard to news media in particular, then the principle of the social media platforms and the search engines paying for content, paying for clicks, does raise some problematic issues, because it does undermine a lot of the basis on which the whole internet functions. However, the question is whether in the case of media organizations, one needs to look at it differently, because an independent, viable media is absolutely essential for a functioning democracy. And if you have a situation where, because of the kind of disruption being brought about by these platforms, which by the way is happening in many sectors, and disruption by itself is not a good enough argument. However, the media entities as a need to be looked at differently because they are so essential to a democracy. And therefore, some governments, starting with Australia, have felt the need to intervene. It's a fact that revenues and advertising revenues in particular for print media and for even visual media have declined dramatically after the advent of these platforms. So a lot of small media have actually gone out of business, and even large media are under threat. So what I think is of major concern in democratic countries is the possible complete undermining of business of media organizations. And as Mr. Matthews has pointed out, building credible, reliable media requires money. So if you don't get any money, then obviously they will go out of business. And if all of us are simply reduced to relying on social media and interchanges with all the fake news there for our news, then God help a democracy. So therefore, the need to actually strike a balance in this case has been felt. And I think each country is going to have to address these issues. Having said that, there is also some equilibrium which is being reached between the social media and the news media organizations on their own without government intermediation. But government mediation is actually helping that to be a less unequal battle.
Okay.
And that's exactly where the Australian government has demonstrated one pathway to leveling that balance.
Okay. And before I go across to Siddharth Padmanabhan, I have one more question for you, Mr. Chandrasekhar, very quickly. Is the idea, to ensure that the news sites, the news publishers get their fair share of revenue, or is it about curbing fake news? Is it about regulation that we are talking about?
I think that, the issue in the context of Australia is about their getting their fair share of revenue. The issue of curbing fake news and other such aberrations, or even accurate news but which is designed to inflame or which is likely to cause inflammation, that's a separate dimension of regulation for which there are in fact separate guidelines. Coincidentally, both happened on the 25th of February.
Yes.
But these are two completely unrelated things in my opinion. One is with regard to the commerce of news,
okay,
and one is with regard to the social harm that can be caused by fake news or by damaging information.
Okay. Mr. Siddharth Padmanabhan, now the question is, and the argument here is that newspapers employ thousands of journalists on the ground who are in the business of news gathering, which is quite expensive. Shouldn't they also be eligible for a fair share of revenue?
Absolutely. I think the on-ground teams, the teams verifying the information, putting together the news for us as a nation, especially in the print segment, one of the most valuable parts of this ecosystem, and definitely should have access to a larger share when it comes to being, correctly compensated for their efforts. However, the question really is, where does that revenue come from? So when it comes to the print media, the INA is a conglomeration of multiple different media houses, maybe private, maybe public. Now, there is always going to be disruption, as Mr. Chandrasekhar rightly puts it, and this is prevalent in all industries across, not just advertising. There has been a clear, consistent growth of online players in the space. Google and Facebook, however, are platforms. They're not news companies as such. So, again, I'll address this in the 2 points that we are talking about here today, or rather, let's say the 3 points that the INA has put forward to Google. First, in terms of news houses and media publications being correctly compensated for the news that they generate. Second, in terms of the advertising revenue that is generated through these news publishers. And third, in terms of fake news and the battle against it. So on my first point, I completely agree that yes, there may be requirement for better compensation, but that compensation, in my honest personal opinion, does not need to come from the big tech companies because they are meagerly a means of distribution. So when there is any business, let's say an online publication, it could be generating great news, but they may not be a very well-renowned media house that's been established for decades. But does that then not qualify them for, say, higher listings on a Google search, like Mr. Matthew was putting across? So I think that's not a decision for a Google or a Facebook to take because these are user-driven platforms.
Then, Mr. Padmanabhan, is that today these companies have become giants only because of the content that they have, that they show to the readers, to the viewers, and that content is actually of somebody else. It belongs to certain news websites. Of course, that's only a portion of the content that we see on internet. There are other things as well, other kind of content too. But, shouldn't then there be a fair sort of a structure for compensation?
So this content was uploaded to the platforms by these news websites themselves because they wanted more reach and more eyeballs on the kind of news that they've created. Now that the reach and eyeballs have been achieved, the argument suddenly turns towards the fact that, hey, we used you to reach out to more people and get our news in front of a wider audience because we believe in the institution of news. We believe that people should have access to timely and correct information. And now that the big tech platforms are facilitating that for them, right? Google or Facebook or any other media publication that you would speak about doesn't really have a say in how user-based communities operate. Google search rankings, for example, are basis a lot of dynamics and they don't really take into consideration any exceptions for a particular industry or a segment. Similarly, on Facebook, when news is being shared, like to put it in the simplest form, there could be fake news and there could be real news. It's actually these big tech companies that I have noticed more often than not doing the most they can to combat fake news.
Okay.
They're not really aggregating it. If you go to a Facebook's business website or a Google's business website, you will see multiple disclaimers, etc., in terms of how and all of the things they are doing as part of the responsibility they carry.
Okay.
Because they've been able to, they're accessible to so many people in order to combat fake news.
Okay.
So against all the 3 points, it's typically very easy to point at the most profitable company here and just say that, hey, we need a fair share.
Okay.
And a fair share is deserved. But my question is, if there is media houses, private media houses, profitable companies who are looking to basically get a sense of how can they get out to more people in a cost-effective way. AdSense revenue, for example, the advertising revenue, of which the INA has demanded 85%.
Right.
It isn't completely true to say that we don't know what we make today.
Okay,
Every
let's get
media
Mr. Matthew to
themselves-
respond to the argument that you've made, and also an important one wherein you said that, in a way these giants have helped these news websites also get a lot of traffic. Mr. Matthew, your response.
Yeah, see, in the beginning, it is our content which actually gave these tech platforms all the authenticity. It's because of the content of publishers, other content sites across the world which gave the tech platforms like Google the credibility. When someone searches, they find a good article which is authentic. So that's how the platform established themselves. The second point is traffic generated by these tech platforms is not remuneration. That is not remuneration at all because it does not give us anything. So coming to the point of making money out of us, the majority of the money of the advertising money goes to Google or the other platforms. So it's not sustainable going forward for any publishing company or another content provider to rely on that small amount of advertising money because,
Okay.
as I said before, journalism, good, credible journalism, you need hundreds of journalists on boots on the ground, and with this small amount, it's just not sustainable.
Mr. R. Chandrasekhar, now, apart from the music industry that Mr. Matthew talked about, we know that Google recently agreed to better compensate and pay publishers in France, EU, and now Australia as well. Shouldn't the same thing then happen in India too?
Yes, I think that in principle, what is now emerging in many countries should very well be applicable to India. And again, there are situations and situations. I referred to the difference between disruption in general and why the news media needs to be looked at differently. So here, if you look at it, even if you look at the entertainment industry, the difference between music and entertainment and news is that by and large, the music and entertainment is repeatedly used, music especially. You don't listen to the song just once and then discard it. News, on the other hand, is by and large a one-time use. You access it when it is current and you don't go back to it. So there are many different attributes to all of these. The fact, of course, is that news in general and authentic news in particular requires significant expenditure. And that's the point which Mr. Matthews had mentioned. As far as the search engines are concerned, they provide a channel through which you can access this news. I can go to, the Times website without going through a Google or any other search engine. But that is the exception. In most of the cases, it is based on how the search engine, through the search engine, I am led to the site, which brings up the importance of the algorithms, which actually prioritize these sites. And when you look at the artificial intelligence that drives this prioritization, it goes also by, what is most viewed by people or what is most demanded. And sometimes fake news or negative news attracts more attention, and it leads to a unfortunate reinforcement cycle of fake news and negative news, which is curbed separately. But the point here is that the Australian code, which has now become law, actually requires these search engines to disclose any changes that are being made in their algorithm, which affects the news channels. The point which was made about how it is prioritized, where the traffic is directed. And I would respectfully submit that, the number of views and when traffic is directed does indirectly affect ad revenues, because if there's a newspaper which has hardly any viewership, you don't get too many advertisements. But if it is a dominant newspaper which really commands all the eyeballs, then surely its advertising revenues are going to get impacted. So there are lots of different moving parts in all of this and lots of differences. But the broader principle that news media need to be compensated when their news is used, not to prevent disruption, because I don't agree with that principle. Okay. But in order to preserve the viability and sanctity of news media, and that's why it needs to be treated differently. That is something I think which we should definitely look at as a country.
Okay, better compensation is needed when it comes to news websites specifically. Mr. Siddharth Padmanabhan, now as far as Australia is concerned, it's a relatively smaller market, for companies like Google and Facebook. And there, if a regulation of this kind, a law of this kind has come and Google has decided to negotiate with the newspapers, news websites for better compensation, India is a much bigger market. Do you think the way chatter has now started, probably Google will have to follow the same route here, because here, Google can't afford to really threaten the viewers that much?
So, firstly, in Australia, it started in 2017, this conversation. It took 3.5 to 4 years to come to fruition where we are today. There is a legislation that has been passed around it, which then puts more pressure on big tech to have a word with media publications, which they have. And they have done deals now directly with media publications in Australia itself. Whereas in India, I don't think the legal system has really gotten involved in terms of creating a mandate or a diktat for these companies.
Okay.
But while there are associations like the INA and the companies that form a part of the INA that are trying to basically replicate what's happened in Australia, one from we need more value for our media creation. So that's one argument. But on the other arguments, wherein the advertising revenue needs to be bumped up, etc., I think that's pretty much a way for them to bargain with these big tech platforms in order to get better media, because they are getting paid now. So it's very important when we think about this argument and we see the title,
Right.
Will Google and Facebook need to pay news media publishers? Let's not forget that Google and Facebook are already giving them a means of revenue. Very secondary, I'm sure, compared to the print revenues, etc. But coming back to my point, there will always be disruption, and we will typically end up pointing fingers at the highest person in that value chain at that point in time. But it's also important to understand that, let's say, even before digital came along, TV
Right.
was disrupting the print industry. Did
Right.
anyone come to the broadcast industry and say, hey, pay up? Because we also are getting the news to originate.
Absolutely.
So it's always going to be one medium after the other.
But as of now, it's only the Indian Newspaper Society which has written to Google. We haven't still really heard from the government. We'll see how the government will have to react to this.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, all of you gentlemen, for joining us here on India Revival Mission.